Hi, everybody. This is Gad Saad. For all of you guys who hate Israel, you're probably going to get more angry because I have another person on today who's going to perhaps give us a justification for the title of Israel being the most moral military. I don't want to put any words in his mouth. John Spencer, how are you doing, sir?
God, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm a huge fan of your work. A real big honor for me.
Oh, you're too kind. Okay, let me just mention a few highlights from your bio that I jotted down from your website, which I'll put in the description section of our chat. Chair of Urban Warfare Studies at West Point. There's always a mystique about West Point. It seems like
Yes.
what a cool place. I'm still waiting for my invitation to speak there. I'm sure it must have gotten lost in the mail somehow. Host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast, author of three books: Understanding Urban Warfare, Connected Soldiers, and the Mini Manual for the Urban Defender. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we drill down?
No, I'm excited for the conversation, and that works for me.
Oh, great. Well, and you are, by the way, I think in two separate services, and you'll correct me. You're both a major in one service and a colonel in another, correct?
So I retired from active duty after 25 years in the U.S. Army as a major, an amazing career. And then after I retired, I went into more service with the California State Guard and became a full-bird colonel in that. So it's not separate services, it's just different types of, I guess, statuses.
Got it. And you both had. So my understanding is if you don't go down the officer track, you start as private, go up, and I think the highest rank there is sergeant major. And then if you start through the commissioned officers, you start, lieutenant all the way to general. And you seem to have titles or ranks in both services. Did I read that right? And if so, explain it to us.
Absolutely. Well, again, not services, but definitely I'm what they call a Mustang. So I graduated high school, joined the Army, started as a private in the enlisted rank, and then went up to sergeant first class, and then went to one of the three ways you can become an officer. You can go to West Point if you can get in, which is I didn't. I taught there full-time faculty and still work there doing research. But I went to Officer Candidate School, which is a program where they want those enlisted soldiers who have done well to become officers. And I became an officer, and you really restart in the officer tracks. You have the enlisted track and the officer track. A great honor for me to see and live both worlds, basically. And we've had a lot of great officers, even the greatest decorated U.S. military person, Audie Murphy, started like that and did a battlefield commission. There's actually many ways you can become an officer of the three commissioning sources. Very few actually go to the service academies like West Point. And I live not too far from an academy. I won't say which one because of the service rivalry. But you can go to an academy or you can go to college, which is most people, which is actually the biggest way. Go to any one of our colleges and join the Officer Training Cadet Corps, basically ROTC,
ROTC, exactly, yes.
which is the biggest producer of officers. So you go to college, you get a bachelor's, you join the military, you start as an officer. And then the last way is my way, which was the officer candidate school, where you're already in the Army, doing college on your own time. And then you can become through this other track, an officer through the officer candidate school.
Well, thank you for that explanation. A couple of interesting sort of personal anecdotes. Number one, when I came from Lebanon and after the first year of the Civil War, which we can get into because you're the urban warfare expert in terms of practicing warfare. I'm the urban warfare expert in terms of having lived it.
Yeah.
But I mean, at least as a sitting duck, as a young child, 11 years old. But in any case, when I moved to the West, my I very quickly acclimatized, became a huge fan of the Dallas Cowboys at the time, and my favorite player was Roger the Dodger Staubach. I don't know if you know where I'm going with this. Now he came in late into the league because after he finished his, I guess, undergrad, he then went and served in the Navy. So he was a rookie quarterback, I think maybe 26 or 27 years old. So that was the first time that I can remember knowing about these programs. The second personal anecdote is when I was so I did my MS and PhD at Cornell, and so they had an ROTC program, and I used to always love seeing the young students come with their, spiffy uniforms. So there you go. Uh, Okay, so let's talk about whatever you want, but we could start with something very, in French, you say au courant, which means contemporary, something that has blown up the internet. The Joe Rogan versus Douglas Murray versus Saad weighs in versus uh, take it wherever you want. What are your thoughts on this thing? Who's right? Who's wrong? Oh, and I guess Dave Smith is the other guy. Take it away.
Well, one, I'm a huge fan of Joe Rogan's. I know he's a friend of yours, and I've been following him as somebody who was in the military within that fight community. I've been following Joe since UFC one. So now the conversation that really took many tentacles and so many people have made it, which is great. Let's have the conversation about which I appreciated your which really the academic lens of like, anybody can do their own research. How did you come to that conclusion and then try to convince the world that your conclusion is the right one, whether it's historical revisionism or just you did your own work and you found something new, which I'm a big fan of doing your research. I had issues with a couple of the parts of it, of course, and Douglas is a friend as well, who does amazing work. I actually met Douglas in a Hamas tunnel in Gaza.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know who he was at the moment. I was like in his, but he was doing that thing that for some reasons I do believe you gain a different perspective, different amount of knowledge of going to battlefields. My type of research, depending on whether I'm doing case study approach or ethnographic or doing interviews in general, but actually walking the ground, you do gain knowledge that you might not if you hadn't been there. So I met Douglas in a Hamas tunnel. I, of course, had a conversation with Dave Smith, who I view as I don't attack the person, like you said, attack the veracity of the statements. Just so many comments for some reason, and I agree, commenting on Douglas of 18 months of commenting about Israel, the status of the nation and its history, or in this case, for me, as a war researcher on Israel's operations in Gaza, whether you believe there's a different way or you have your own position of what's been done. And for Dave, and I've written a piece because that's what I think people do if you want to actually form a logical, which I love writing. Writing is like thinking on paper for me. You might have a good idea, but okay, well, run that logically and create a convincing argument on paper. So Dave's position that he has reiterated on Candace Owens, Lex Friedman, Joe Rogan multiple times, now Piers Morgan is this wanting to question the morality of war by using this false analogy of comparing it to law enforcement, which is like the analogy he keeps using. No matter how much I tried when I was talking on Piers, like it's not right. Let's define words. Let's define morality, right? How does
Tell us the analogy for those folks who don't know what you're referring to.
Yeah, Dave Smith analogy he continues to use where he says that if somebody came into your home and killed your child, and then that person went back into a building where he has his family and there are other families, and you bomb that building knowing in order to get to that person, it would be intentional cold-blooded murder. And then there's no difference just because he says, just because a politician calls something a war and there's been lines drawn, it's the same thing in war. If you know there are non-combatants or civilians, and he likes to, and I really appreciate your analogy of the two babies. Like there is not moral equivalency in this context. Morality does have a social construct. Laws are a embodiment of morality and legality, which is like what is right and what is wrong. So yes, even in a civil setting, which you shouldn't compare to a war setting, which has its own body of work.
Right.
And as a researcher, like how did we get to the point where we have this framework? If you want to argue, if you think you're Immanuel Kant and you want to argue the morality of war, do that. Do that research. I love it and we can have that conversation. But you can't argue by just continually saying the words, which you almost have a Princess Bride moment. I don't think you know what that word means. You keep saying it, but I don't think you know even what morality means or how it applies in a civil setting, right? So in this scenario, and I articulate in this article that I have out for publication, is in that civil setting, the morality is all within the law, whether it's in the codification of actual civil law or even religious, cultural, other aspects of right and wrong. In murder, right? So in self-defense, it's not called murder. You can actually kill people in self-defense, even not the person you're trying to, and it not be considered murder. There's involuntary manslaughter. There's all these other, and we have courts that adjudicate that. And in that scenario, for vigilantes, you'd send the police, like use the social construct that is required, and then you get tried by a judge and all these things. In war, it's not that, that's not the same construct. So you have to judge it, which evidently, everybody from Piers Morgan to Dave Smith can be the judge of war actions, to include people that take a small clip and say, look, clearly this is wrong. I've had to come now. I hope we get to talk about it. I've spent more time in the last 18 months teaching War 101, like to people outside of even the urban warfare context of like, what can you and can't you do in a war? What are the rules that we've all agreed upon? How is it done? All these things. And I had a small conversation with Dave about this, which is out of the conversation with Joe and Douglas, about this, and he just was going in circles saying, "You're not understanding logic and morality." Like, no, I understand it. You're misapplying it. And we didn't even get to the other things. There's so many other things where, which is really crafty, right? We live in this world where the court jester becomes the arbitrator of narratives, where he takes a tidbit of information that is true and then weaves a really convincing, comical even, but just really convincing narrative of something that isn't true, whether that's Israel's supposed blockade, um, and then or apartheid, all these. Dave Smith tried to argue that Israel's not a democracy because the people in Gaza don't have the right to vote. Like it's there's just so many ways to approach. I try to stay in my lane, God, of warfare, urban warfare, strategy, but sometimes like that's ridiculous. I gotta take that on.
Well, so a couple of things I want to add to your wonderful explanation. Number one, and I've repeated this, on several occasions recently because it stemmed from a conversation I had with a British psychiatrist who had invited me on a show about a year ago, and he asked me for the first time ever, someone had asked me this question. I thought it was a great question. What is the most surprising thing that you've uncovered about human nature? And so I had to pause for a second. I thought probably the inability of people to alter their positions once it is solidly anchored. And so I think what Dave Smith is doing is it doesn't matter how many wonderful, explanations John Spencer or anybody else might offer him. It's la la la. There is nothing that you could ever say that's going to shift me from my position, which is one of the reasons why I'm very tepid to ever have debates with some folks. Not because I'm afraid. I mean, as you probably know, I'm hardly one to walk away from a fight, but at least the fight has to be done in a proper, honest spirit, whereby we both agree what the rules are, we get into the ring. And by the way, I have enough epistemic humility that if you teach me something that causes me to change my position, I go, you know what? I never knew that, John. That's a great point. Thank you. And I think I'm going to revise my opinion. But if I'm going to speak to certain people that I know a priori, there's nothing I could say that can ever get you to change your mind. What's the point of then engaging in the exchange? But my second point, I was going to, this is actually a question. So, what would be some metrics? I mean, you're a researcher, you have to quantify things, you have to operationalize things. One metric that we've seen is the ratio of combatant to innocent people. Is that the right metric? Are there other metrics? What is the metric by which we could definitively say the IDF are the biggest butchers in the history of humanity since the Nazis, or they are actually the most moral military in the world?
It's a great question. Actually, I was hoping we could get to it because it's what I've had to. I didn't know that the small little book that I used in grad school, because I didn't do quantitative analysis, research and others more qualitative, but this book called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics.
Oh, yes. I love that book.
It's just I highly recommend it to everybody. Um, Especially in the last 18 months because people were struggling to find a number and as it's just it's such a great book where one of my favorite quotes out of the book, although I paraphrase it, is that figures don't lie, but liars sure do figure, where they'll take that number. So to answer your question, and I actually got told this in Jerusalem not too long, last month, that "Hey, you're that civilian to combatant ratio guy." Like, no, that's not me. Because I push back against it. It is not the correct metric. Matter of fact, I try to point out that I've been studying war for over a decade academically, writing case studies and books and articles, and that's never come up. Actually, because I use case study methodology, and I'll have another one published tomorrow on a fascinating battle. Well, I actually look for the quantitative data in both the qualitative experience of a battle of, okay, how many people do have died, how much destruction was done, because in urban warfare, it becomes a big part of the conversation. But as soon as the war in, against Hamas and Gaza came out, that was interestingly sticking in the kind of court of public opinion. Look how many people have died. Compare, and well, who's saying that? Well, Hamas says that. Like, okay, we should take that with a grain of salt. And then as the war continued for months, the number was just being used of like just in a disproportionate, which again, words have meaning and proportionality and what the law of war says about proportionality. And when does it change and when can be different? It is not the metric because that's not the way war works. If it was a number, right? And I actually got this, I think I was on Ana Cabrera and MSNBC when it was supposedly the Hamas number was 10,000. She's like, John, when is enough enough? When have enough people died? Like, as you have pointed out about past wars of like borders and populations and all of that, like I want us to all have the shared framework. And this question of, but what's your civilian to combatant ratio is never been asked in any of my research ever during a battle. And one of the reasons that is because it is ahistorical for any nation to ever believe that you could have a number on a day-to-day basis with any type of validity, right? Where did you come? How did you get that number? And I've tried to point that out by saying, okay, look, we shouldn't be trusting the number that Hamas is giving. And lots of people have done research. I mean, from a historical case study analysis, I can show you that in almost every battle that I've ever studied, there was definitely not during the battle, and it was months, if not years or decades afterwards, where there was a number. And one of the great examples I love,
By number, you mean the ratio of civilian to combatants.
any number.
Okay. Right.
Uh,
Okay. Go
so
on.
the great question, well, let's take on the civilian to combatant ratio, right? So in order to have that number, you would have to have some type of validity on who is the determinant of whether somebody was a civilian and whether somebody was a combatant, right? When you're in a war like this one or others where there's the combatant purposely doesn't wear a uniform, violates the law of war and doesn't distinguish themselves. And the example I give is like Ukraine, which I've been early in the war. Every one of the civilians who joined to resist for their freedom tied a yellow or blue tape around their arm. I don't know where they got that much tape, but they were doing the right thing on designating themselves as partaking in the hostilities. So in a place like Gaza, where they purposely try to blend in with the civilians, so who is the arbitrator? In this case, the world wants it to be Hamas, Gaza Health Ministry. And I don't know if you read Natan Sharansky's book about what when a government lives in fear. Yeah, when
I
you have a
haven't read the book, but go ahead.
and I know from like in Lebanon, like in a society under fear, where they'll say he had something I forget what he called it, but basically you're trusting the populations who lives in fear. So there's no number that's going to come out of Gaza that isn't approved by Hamas if it's not legitimately Hamas that's giving it. But who is saying on the ground, looking at a body, okay, that person was not a combatant. And then, well, of course, well, John, what about the women and children? I'm like, hey, I don't want to be heartless about this, but who says that women can't be combatants? And who says that, okay, what's the age in which somebody is considered a child? According to the United Nations, it's 18. So when we say this is the number of children that have died, they're saying 18 and below. I joined the military at 17. And I try not to get into all these numbers, but the biggest thing is I want people to get out of the numbers game. That's not how, even the law of war is not effects based, right? So lots of really amazing professors have talked about this of like the entire construct of war isn't effects based on look at the damage that has been created. That means you weren't following the law, you were immoral, all these things. One of the examples I like to use about the numbers, right? These are all just lies, damn lies, and statistics. Is that Bernie Sanders about when the Hamas number reached 25,000 said Gaza, the bombing of Gaza is worse than Dresden. And the reason that he did that, I'm sure somebody told him that, was because he had tied a correlation between 25,000 dead to the 25,000 that had died in the bombing of Dresden during World War II. Now, what he didn't know is that for over 50 years, the number was 250,000 because immediately after the bombing, no other than Goebbels himself and the Department of Propaganda put out the number 250,000 had died, and it went unquestioned for decades until the wall fell, until some German researchers went in and started doing the numbers. That's a bad, that's a. I thought it was ironic that he was using that comparison. For me, I started in the beginning going, look, if even if you use these numbers, right? Which I try to get people out of the numbers game. But if you took Hamas's number, which is fraught with craziness on how they got to the number, right? People believe they're counting bodies. They're not. But it's irrelevant. If you took the number, Israel actually took about 6 months to come out with a combatant number, like what they believed in targeting and everything through their after actions report, commanders' assessments of what they believe were the combatants that they were targeting. And then I said, well, if you took these numbers, which they're both highly problematic to believe that you could have a number in the battle, then it would be this ratio to push against what people were saying as the ratio's awful. Although like you said, learning um, I was trying to show people that in comparison, if you want to do comparisons, although there was no comparison, right? So I had written the Battle of Mosul, which is the biggest battle since World War II, was this battle in Iraq against ISIS, who had taken a city of over 1 million and held it for 2 years because the Iraqi government couldn't get it back. But for 2 years, really done a lot of work to prepare to defend it. And it was a 9 month long battle involving over 100,000 Iraqi security forces to take the city back just from 3 to 5,000 combatants. And I used that as a compare early on, like that was like a 1 to 1, a 2 to like all this ratio stuff. But I also highlighted it was a year after that battle before anybody had a number, and the number was from 10,000 to 40,000. So
Right.
no, to the answer, I know a long answer, but that is not the metric of assessment. You could have a very high number, and it isn't that you're illegal or immoral. You have to view it in the context, and the law of war accounts for that context, right? This is the whole the number of in a single strike or an operation, the civilian collateral damage, or that's both the death of civilians, but also the destruction, can't be excessive to the concrete military advantage, which we could argue, like, is there a concrete military advantage to Israel pursuing getting its hostages back, destroying what this terrorist army that invaded Israel, an existential threat, which actually matters a lot when you start talking about what is excessive and disproportionate. And then you have to do this other thing in modern wars, which is the other thing I've written a lot about, is that it is the legal and moral ethical responsibility to try to limit civilian damage. And there's this thing called feasible steps. And this is where I've argued that Israel, and it really doesn't sound good, right? Because they take this number and like, I don't care what John Spencer, this researcher in urban warfare says, look at the numbers, look at the damage, look what I can see on my cell phone. One, there's problems with all of that. But it's a responsibility in the military and a war to take all feasible steps to limit civilian damage. And this is where I've said, again, quantitatively, in comparison to everything that's come before, that Israel has done more to limit civilian death and destruction than any military in the history of war. Now, I won't go as far as to say that Israel is the most moral military in the world. I served in a moral, ethical military, but it is one of the Western militaries, which is I'm sure we could talk about like you have these Western militaries, democracies where legitimacy, moral, ethic, following the laws that we all agreed to is really important to us. I can also compare it to ones that don't. Like I could compare it to Russia's operations in Chechnya. I could compare it to the Syrian war, to the Yemeni war, but I don't. So I'll give you comparisons because everybody seems to want to feel better if they can compare it to something else. But Gaza, on many levels, from a war research perspective, has no comparison.
Well, I'll add a few types of currencies that don't necessarily calculate, how many each party have killed, because that's a ridiculous comparison. I mean, to your earlier point about Dresden, by that metric, then the United States is officially the most evil country in the world because they dropped two atomic bombs on two cities where the overwhelming majority were not combatants. So by that ratio, then we really need to get rid of the United States because, I mean, there's never been anything so cruel. Of course, that's not how you do it. Now, the other thing I would mention, I discussed this in not my last appearance on Joe Rogan, but the time before, where I tried to explain the concept of intent. In the law, we know, for example, that someone who commits involuntary vehicular manslaughter and kills five people. So it's five people. So let's use the counter of death, five. But it was involuntary manslaughter. Maybe it was negligent. Maybe he was driving too fast. I mean, of course, it would be more problematic if he had also drank, but let's remove the alcohol. Now, so that person who just killed five people might get a certain sentence, whatever it is. Let's call it 4 years, 5 years, 8 years. Okay. Another person, a wife who wants to get through pecuniary means, I want to get the insurance policy on my husband. I contract a hitman. The hitman turns out to be a undercover cop, but it was completely contracted. On Tuesday, he will be here. You kill him. I will get the money. I'll pay you $10,000. And then they stop that person because they arrest her. Zero people were killed. In the other one, five people were killed. Oh, surprise, surprise. The person who led to zero killings, even though it's a lower number than five, is going to receive a much larger penalty. It could be up to the death penalty, even if there wasn't a death. So the idea that we somehow remove intent from these moral calculations is insane. So that's number one. So now let's apply that metric to the intent of one group of people versus the other. The noble, peaceful Palestinians wish to eradicate this other people called Jews, not Israelis, not Zionists, Jews. If they had the means, they would certainly do it. Regrettably, from their perspective, they don't have the means, so we will butcher orgiastically and with complete orgasmic glee at 1,200 people. And as we know, the guy, and oh, by the way, I do speak the language, it's my mother tongue. When the guy calls his dad to get his approval, hey, dad, I just killed 10 Jews with my own. Well done, son. Good, well done. We're all proud of you here. That intent matters. Israel could eradicate every single person living in Gaza in less than the time that it took me to say the sentence, but they didn't. And since 2005 till October 7th, 2023, they didn't bother anybody. You F off us, we won't bother you. So intent matters in this calculus, but imbeciles only see five as greater than zero. Therefore, they should receive a. What do you think of this analysis?
100%. And you've covered it in many analogies, which fine if people want analogies to help them understand, but don't refuse to accept the fact that intentionality is factored into multiple social constructs, from morality to the law of civil societies to the laws of war. And they're there on purpose to account for this really hard decisions and intentionalities in morals and ethics and all this in war. 100%. For me, that and that for me on October, when I had watched the video of just segments of what happened on October 7th, I used pattern recognition of saying, this is something very different. I've led men into war, and I've never seen the psychopathy, and that's I know that's your world. That was the Hamas fighters in the glee in what they were doing. Like I've seen awful things and I've seen evil around the world. That was a very special type of evil, and people are trying to kind of do away with it, and then they battle like what they uploaded it and they say they want to do it again. But for me, like everybody wants a framework, and I know you analogies is one. They want a framework to understand, even if they aren't already anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. They believe that Israel shouldn't exist. They want to go back to, changing the borders. Like, yeah, I want to, 1947, 67, 73, like all these times that all these Arab nations have attacked Israel. I don't care what the outcome was. It's just wrong that Israel
You
exists.
forgot 1956, but
Yeah,
go ahead.
56. I mean, and for Gaza, I don't forget, not just 2008, 2014, all the times that Hamas, the elected and whatever, attacked Israel. And there was a ceasefire. I was there in 2021 when the last time Hamas had launched a salvo of rockets. Um, it's the intentionality is accounted for there. That was a special type of evil that was basically invaded. And even I have problems with words like terrorist attack. Okay, yes, they use terrorism, awful tactics of fear and mutilations and all these things, but it was an invasion. That was as much of a military invasion as I can define it. And with the intent, like you said, what was the so this is the idea of people, and I had this conversation with Jordan Peterson, right? This human nature concept, like everybody has universal human interest, right? We all want safety for our children, we all want human rights, and not Hamas. And
Right.
that's not me saying that, that's their statements. What they intended to do on October 7th wasn't just to achieve freedom and to lift the so-called, barricade, you name all these things. They said they wanted to destroy Israel, and their actions met that intent and their statements and everything. The framework, though, after October 7th, right? One, let's classify October 7th what it was. Everything that's come afterwards should be viewed through a war analysis. Israel, as a sovereign nation, again, this is where Dave Smiths want to go back to, like, I don't care what the framework is, it's just wrong. Like, look, after World War II, where awful things happened, right? World War II, even the firebombing of Tokyo, we killed more in one night of firebombing Tokyo than we did in two nuclear bomb drops, right? We killed 180,000 a single night, 300,000 in the bombing campaign. But after World War II, we say, okay, look, these are the things that we will, won't do based on shared frameworks. So October 8th, Israel, a sovereign nation, declares war against Hamas, the political and military entity of Gaza. With that's just war, and then we could argue whether it's justly executed. But by every metric, it is. But I've come to find out that it doesn't matter what John Spencer says. There's this double standard, and I call it an Israeli standard. If we're looking at, but yeah, okay, I know that applies everywhere else, but this is Israel, who is in its very nature, if not evil, intentionally trying to eradicate people.
Well, what's amazing, so I grew up, I lived it, I breathed it, I bathed in unbelievable Jew hatred. And this is in quote what was then the Paris of the Middle East, progressive, modern, cosmopolitan Lebanon. Every fabric of society, every nook and cranny, every strand of social DNA is fueled by orgiastic Jew hatred. The Western mind cannot understand this. What you saw on October 7th is exactly what happens to people when, straight out of the womb, they are taught a hatred like no other. Now, look, sometimes people get upset at me because they say, "Oh, you're trying to win the victimology. You're the guy who's against victimology poker, and you're the guy who now wants to for everybody to say that, oh, that's something unique about the Jews." All bigotry is terrible. I mean, right? But we can't Two people can be overweight. One person could be 20 pounds overweight. Another person could be 200 pounds overweight. Both are called overweight, but there's this thing called scale. Scale matters. Jew hatred has many different sources. It's a multi-pronged, monster. There is academic left Jew hatred. There is neo-Nazi Jew hatred. Islamic Jew hatred is a unique creature. Now, let me just draw. I mean, I'm sure you already know a lot of this, but I want to kind of reiterate it for our viewers and listeners. When I teach about the ethics of targeting children and advertising, one of the ways that you decide, one of the moral frameworks, moral and psychological frameworks that you decide whether what age you should target them is if the child has the cognitive awareness to understand that the advertiser is trying to persuade him of something. That way, I can erect a defense against your persuasion strategy. And we can debate what that is at 10 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old, right? Now, imagine that on the one hand, I can't sell you chewing gum or cereal as a child because you don't yet have the cognitive apparatus to protect against my advertising approach. But straight out of the womb, under the guise, under the cloak of religion, I can teach you that the most vile, the most disgusting, the most diabolical, the subhuman species called the Jew is something to be eradicated. That's how you get October 7th. Now, many people will say, but my friend Ahmad is married to a Jew. He's lovely. Of course, there are millions of beautiful and peaceful and kind Muslim people out of 2 billion Muslims. But does Islam offer the trajectory for October 7th? Absolutely, yes. What are your thoughts on that?
When I look to your research and your statements for a lot of that, from my lane of this small piece of the pie from a research perspective, and when the war happens, the radicalization of the enemy is very factors into it, right? Because there is this strategy. War is a contest of will. You're trying to impose your will and compel your enemy to do what you want it to do. In this case, surrender, give up the hostages, de-arm, demilitarize. But when I started watching the Palestinian Sesame Street, so I think it's beyond religion. As a father of young children, that's a special type of evil.
Talk,
When you
talk about it because people might not know what you're referencing.
Right. So in Gaza, on top of the education system, so it's beyond religion, right? Religion being the Islamic radical fundamentalist view on Islam. Beyond that is the cultural social aspect of in Gaza. Not only do all the textbooks teach Jew hatred and all the analogies are through this killing of Jews. But there's Sesame Street that they developed basically with like TiVo, like these characters, literally teaching the child from birth, like you said, but you have to get into what their parents are telling them as well. But everything they consume is to hate the Jews and that their poverty is the cause of the Jews, another factor, right? The Israel and the Jewish people are the cause of their poverty. And then we could talk about, well, in Gaza, when the leaders of Hamas are billionaires sitting in Qatar, the ones in Gaza are multimillionaires. But for me, so that factors into it because when you talk about radicalization, like separating Hamas from the population, like, okay, yeah, in war, we account for that. Are you partaking in the hostilities or are you not? If you're not, then you're a non-combatant, you're protected. If you are in any way, and there's very criteria, like if you're holding hostages, you're partaking in the hostilities. But when you're trying to convince the enemy that he has been defeated, if they're so radicalized, and then for this case, as a political apparatus, where I've tried to highlight it's very unique when a moral, ethical, legal following where legitimacy is important, all these things, you're fighting an enemy who uses not just human shields, which I think people overuse. Hamas uses human sacrifice
Right.
because of, again, with that religious cultural mindset, their entire war strategy, which is the pursuit of political goals, is to get as many of their population killed as possible.
You love life as much as we love death.
Yes. So that's the saying and the intent, but the actions, right? So the 400 miles of tunnels, very unique in war. 400 miles of tunnels in Gaza, dug under every structure, ranging from just underneath buildings to 200 feet underground. The entire population could fit in that tunnel network with ease. But since Hamas says, like they actually say, we need the death of our women, children, elderly to achieve our goal to destroy Israel. They also act that way. So how do you fight that is very different, right? The Nazis didn't do that. They didn't say like, I need the whole German population to die so we can achieve this vision of the Third Reich. ISIS, Al Qaeda, like all these other evil organizations didn't deploy this human sacrifice strategy. That's very unique. You're right. It has a very religious bent to it, but I think it's beyond that cultural, social, from birth perspective that you get to what you saw on October 7th, which was the level of dehumanization, and really psycho. Like, how do you build? I made an analogy that it was more like Hamas had developed and released 2,000 Jeffrey Dahmers into Israel.
Yeah. I think Jeffrey Dahmer would be peaceful compared because there's a lust of violence
Yeah.
that's difficult for people to understand. And I mean, in your case, you've been to the field both, as a warrior and as a researcher, so you're certainly closer to it. But you really have to come from that culture and be the target of that hate to really understand it. For most people that come from the West, they simply can't relate to it. I'll give you a great story, which I originally discussed in The Parasitic Mind. But there is a sequela to that story, which I'm not sure if I've mentioned this publicly, so we may be breaking new ground here. So at one point, it was probably around 2010, a friend of mine whom I originally had met at the university that my home university. I'm currently at a Michigan university, but my home university, Concordia University in Montreal, uh, she had reached out to me. She's Jewish, and she reached out to me to say, "Hey, I know you come from the region. You're a big expert on all this stuff. That I'm friends with this woman, a Muslim woman, who is doing her PhD in Islamic studies, and she's telling me that it's absolutely untrue. There is no Jew hatred in Islamic theology. So what is it, Gad? Tell me, is it yes or is it no?" So I decided, John, to instead of, sending her a long email with the 73,000 pieces of evidence that would suggest that this other woman is fibbing, I just shared a montage, which I wonder if you're familiar with it. It's about a 22-minute montage of Islamic leaders and scholars and television shows and Sesame Street and the rest of it from many, many different countries, all Islamic, highlighting what is being said about the Jew and using Islamic doctrines. And these would be, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the head of Sunni Islam from Al-Azhar University. So we can't say he misunderstands Islam. He doesn't know Islam, but your friend understands Islam. One of the last parts, snippets from that clip, John, was an Islamic scholar or imam showing photos of the Nazis killing the Jews and taking bulldozers and putting their emaciated bodies all into the unmarked graves. And the guy is using this kind of religious lamentation and incantation, saying, "Oh God, oh Allah, why do you hate us so that you didn't give us the pleasure of killing the Jews? Why do you hate us so that you gave that pleasure to the Nazis?" It's a level of diabolical hate that's difficult for most human minds to understand. Okay, so let put that aside. When I shared that clip with her, with no other editorializing, this is a Jewish woman who, by the way, some of her ancestors were part of that bone rubble in the Holocaust. She writes back to me, "Well, I guess you're no different in your extremism than they are." So my sharing a clip of their extremism meant that I too was an extremist. So, of course, I never spoke to her again. I didn't want to have anything to do with her. About a year ago, I received an email from her saying, "I can't believe how I reacted to you so many years ago, and you were so right." So the point of this is not to say, "Good boy, Gad, you were right," but number one, here is a Jewish woman who was perfectly parasitized. that she wasn't willing to distinguish between me showing her the clips of the extremism and the extremists. And then, on a more hopeful note, people do sometimes change. It took her 14, 15 years, but she came around.
It reminds me of a quote that Jordan hit me with as well. And when I try to come back with this evidence, like my belief that for the Jewish state, Israel, there's a different standard in war, right? And that's historical. We do case studies on every war, what happened and when did it end and why did it end? Usually because of international community saying, look, I know you were attacked. I know you were attacked by five nations, but you need to stop, period. Stop here, right? Jordan said, well, what's your evidence that evidence convinces anybody of anything?
Right.
When it is, and this is again your world of the feeling and the emotion, and no matter what you present them with, the heuristic biases and all these things are factoring into their decision making. But for me, it's like what argument do you want to use? Comparative, case study, ethnographic, like for war perspective, I believe that, and this is the evolution of nations. And again, the Dave Smiths don't want to have that conversation. Like, I don't care about that. Like, but that's how we in this global, how we all thrive. And there are wrongs and people do wrong all the time. Um, but we have to have a shared framework. And then we elect people in democracies to make those decisions for us. But that story really resonates with me as like, I almost like, why did I become the guy to make these arguments is because maybe I knew some information that others, or I could just say like, hold up a minute, like that's never been asked of a nation in war before. It's insane. How do we know these numbers, like all these things, and like where the tactics are working. And so from a psychology perspective, I'll tell you this. In war, when we teach war, there's always three populations that really matter if you care about the construct. You have the militaries that are fighting each other, right? And that's their will to continue to fight. And you're always trying to, morale, will, all these things. You're trying to degrade that to make them surrender. Then you have the will of the two political apparatuses that war is, and their populations. Unfortunately, we live in this world now, in very unique for wars, where the populations can make up their own mind, right? They can see it on their own algorithm-driven videos and pictures of destruction and damage and say, like, I don't care what you say, John Spencer. I don't care what came before. I can see it from my own eyes. I don't know if there's a psychological term for that of like,
Well,
I'm
it's the vividness heuristic, right? Something that is vivid that I can link up with my own eyes carries a lot more weight than all of the statistical inferential evidence that I could ever show you to the contrary.
yeah. And this is, I mean, this is the again, I'm actually anti-war. So this is the thing where, some people say they're anti-war. I'm actually anti-war, but I also understand what is preventing wars. And consequences is a big part of that. You have deterrence. So this is the ideal that just ceasefire now, right? I, as somebody who's anti-war, understand that if somebody violated all the things that we put in place to not have wars, like wars of aggression, or like what Hamas did, a genocidal invasion, like truly trying to genocide somebody, then there has to be consequences. Like you don't get to say oopsie daisy and then just put the wall back up that wasn't and just say like I won't do it again, I promise. No, if you start a war, there are consequences so that other people don't start wars. And you can still do that in a just way, like Israel is executing the war, trying to separate the population who aren't involved in the war, which is really hard to do when there's another country, Egypt, and I know you've talked a little bit about that, who says also violates all the international norms, going, look, I don't care about the Palestinian people, not one of them
It's
into the
coming
Sinai
into,
Desert,
yeah.
which is unique in war, right? So even if you really care, then you should be protesting Egypt's actions since October 7th. They launched a division almost, a brigade, a whole tank element to the border to make sure that no Palestinian civilians came out of Gaza. And they put up a new wall with razor wire and everything. Not one civilian is going to come out of Gaza. You need to stay in there with a war that the political apparatus created. So yeah, let's protest Egypt.
No, no, no Jews, no news, as they say, right?
This is true.
By the way, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has gone publicly and said, I don't care about the Palestinian plight. I care about my own people. So apparently he must also be a Islamophobe. I wanted to spend a few minutes. Can we go a bit longer? Are you okay? Or do you
Absolutely.
Oh,
I can
okay,
go as
great.
long as you can. I love long form. Actually, that's another thing I enjoy about Joe is like, you're not going to come on here with your talking points. Let's talk this out.
Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. Uh, so that's I know you're at West Point, so I don't know if I ask any question that you're uncomfortable with, you can kind of say I'm not speaking. But prior to Pete Hegseth, of course, under Joe Biden, uh, the military went super woke, and that's something that you really don't want. And now, of course, Pete is trying to reverse that. Now, you've been in that setting, both as a warrior and as a professor at West Point, so on. In your day-to-day practice as someone who is at West Point, do you see wokeness or not? And if you have seen it, do you see it as having been somewhat reversed now that the new administration is up? Take it wherever you want to go.
So that's a hard one, God, as you know.
Okay.
I say I don't do politics, and I really try to stay apolitical like our military is. But I also do war, which is politics by other means, and it factors into wars greatly. I will say on that, West Point's a very unique location, right? It's our best of our best. Designed very uniquely, and if people understand, two cadets or two basically of the best of every state having to be approved by their senators in order to get admissions. So it's like this, it's not a good sample size. It isn't a good test of the greater multi-million person military that we have. I will say that this idea of social evolution and social ideals being incorporated into the military is not new either. From don't ask, don't tell to other aspects, it's a part of it. So I always had that there. I will say that there were trends, and you could see them at the United States Military Academy or others. I'm speaking for myself only,
I don't
where
want to get you in trouble.
yeah, it's really hard. Where the trend was going to, and I am absolutely for the purpose of the military is to deter war, and when deterrence fails, to win in combat, and you need the best, really by performance, by metrics of not just the social designs, but the actual best warrior who can do the job. And there have been swings. That's about as far as I'll take it,
Okay,
God.
can I just question? It won't
Sure.
it won't bother. It won't get you. Don't worry about it. So, as a war expert and military expert, are you telling me that having twerking drag queens in the military doesn't increase the efficacy of the military?
I will say it's a the answer to that is simply yes. I wasn't, of course. You want your military to be trained to actually, and I think where people get the words wrong, we actually, and let's talk about what we would have done on with Gaza after October 7th. We would have used overwhelming force to dominate the enemy quickly and
Right.
to get it done. In order to do that, you have to have a joint force that's made up of your best. That is apolitical, focused on the mission and the requirements of the mission. From the infantryman, like I was, ability to carry heavy stuff over great distances and do almost
That's toxic
unachievable.
masculinity, though, no?
No, no, it's not. It's job performance, right? So this is the genderless standards, right?
Right.
So there are two genders. I do believe that, but I also believe in the military, historically and by basic, and again, research, there are physical requirements to do certain jobs, and you
How
got to
dare you, sir? How dare you? Yes,
no,
go
you
on.
got to be able to do that. So if it's a policy that is beyond that, I agree. It was damaging. It was doing damage. And no, each one job, and then it gets into a lot of other debates. But I, as a career infantryman who had to carry really heavy things for very far distances and do certain things, each one of these jobs, and they're different, have very specific physical and cognitive requirements. And if you don't meet those, then you don't do the job.
That makes sense. All right, I want to talk about a couple of cool things because I am with a military expert. So uh, I hope you enjoy it, but I certainly do, and I know that my son will. Most young boys, love guys in the military and the ranks and so on. So first, I want to talk about a study. I think it was done at West Point, and I could probably get you the reference. This is a very serious academic study where they took the photos of incoming, as you said, sort of very selective incoming folks. I can't remember the year it was, probably 60, 70, something like that. And based on their photos, which had differing markers of testosterone, they could then predict the likely trajectory of success going up in the ranks much later in their career. So that's kind of linking some of the evolutionary stuff that I do in my scientific research to the military. Are you familiar with that study, by the way?
I am not actually. That's
Okay.
interesting. I thought you were going to go with the grit study. There's a really,
Oh, yes, that's the grit that's covered in the book called Grit by
yeah, Duckworth. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
Duckworth. Yes, yes, I know that study. That is very cool too. Second point, of all of the militaries, I've always, sometimes my son and I would sit together, he wants to know what are the ranks and so on. He's now 13. So okay, you've got the Army, you've got the Air Force, you've got the Marines, you've got the Navy. Am I missing anybody? No. I mean
Coast
the
Guard,
Coast Guard.
now
Okay.
Space Force.
There's okay, fine. Uh so no disrespect to anybody who's serving there. Do not send me hate mail. I'm on your side. Uh I always oscillate between who's the coolest.
That's
Okay.
easy.
Okay, you got to say it's the Army?
Of course. I mean, I don't have to say. I mean, it's just fact.
Why is that? Okay, hey, tell me so, Colonel. Why is that?
By the mission, by the history, by the diversity of the size and scale, right? So there's a scaling problem, right? So even if you understand the difference between the U.S. Marine Corps, which are hardcore warriors, but also the scale of it and their pyramid of mostly people that only have done one rotation of service, but based on the pyramid that is in the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Army is much larger and has a more diversity of goals and units to achieve, from our elite forces down to what wins wars, which is a joint force, which has to evolve. If you want to really, so I'm a land-based guy, right? So I don't believe in certain people that believe you can, bomb your way to achieve a certain goal. You do have to move forward and seize what the enemy cares about most, his ground and his power, to include over his population. To say who's coolest, we could go through different types of units and the scales and the
All right.
requirements.
Can I give you my
Yeah,
very
let's hear it.
layman approach, which probably you could predict? Come on, Navy pilots landing on the aircraft carrier. That's got to be the coolest, no? No.
Not coolest. I mean, this go again, like the Air Force, which was in the Army. So it started in the Army.
Oh, is that true?
Yeah, the Army started as the U.S. Army Air Corps, which is a great study. I mean, the Army is, or the military is so fascinating as a study of sociology and other cultural aspects to their bureaucracies. They think a certain way, but we rejected the airplane. We rejected the tank. If you look at that history, but the Air Force began in the U.S. Army Air Corps, so it's our baby, a redheaded stepchild now, and all those evolutions of air power started, in the U.S. Army. I thought you were going to quote a study, which I think is fascinating as well, about openness. So they've done a lot of studies of an individual's openness in like our war colleges and stuff, like where it actually is the system creates a thinker who's not open to new information because you're
Right.
the commander, you're supposed to make a decision, you're supposed to know it all, but that's actually counterproductive to the complexity that is war, which is uncertain and complex, and you need all kinds of expertise.
You need some malleability, some
You need
flexibility.
malleability. And our greatest, this is where going back to that credentialing thing, now I'm giving my own personal thoughts again, is that I don't give, of course, I give a lot of respect to generals, of course, and their service and their dedication, but I also don't automatically give them
Yeah.
not even knowledge because you can do a job and achieve a certain level And you can also not do a job. I mean, Eisenhower wasn't somebody who commanded every formation up to the rank of five-star general, but openness and then the ability to do studies. Some of our greatest, for me, actual generals, ones who don't just that experiential knowledge, but they studied everything in the past, right? Whether it's General McMaster, Petraeus, even Mad Dog Mattis, were readers and learners of everything that's come before in our profession. Um, but this is even like Dave Smith's like, well, this four-star general told me this. I'm like, okay, but that
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean they are like, because we have credentialing systems within the military, but it isn't necessarily the way people believe it is.
Right. Wow. Uh, I was going to ask, since you talked about openness, I'm sure this has been done, but maybe not. If not, maybe this is an opportunity to study this. Are there any studies that look at the typical personality profile of people who choose each of those different, Air Force, Marines, whatever? So I mean, obvious one, sniper, which by the way would be one of my other cool ones for obvious reasons, has to have a set of unique skills that others don't share. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to be a sniper. So, is there a psychological profile that is more likely, if I administer this to John Spencer and I look at it, I go, oh, I see Marine written all over you, or has that been studied? Do you know of any such studies?
I'm sure it has. Interesting, and I've done this research, a little bit of research, again, my field of what are the tests for entry, right? What are the entry tests for the US military? Most of them are aptitude tests, right? So like all the sciences
Right.
and then based on that, they'll place you in professions. Each one of the services have their own requirements. But no, that I'm sure somebody's done that personality typing, although there's, whether it's Myers-Briggs or all these things. I know there's issues with all these tests.
Sure.
Um, it, Interestingly, although, did you know that Dr. Ruth was an Israeli sniper?
The little one?
Yes,
Dr. Ruth, the
she was
sexologist?
she was a Israeli sniper. But then you get into the conversation of what is the Haganah and all these other things before the creation of the Israeli state. So there is a little of what a sniper is today, but also the work that has been done by Israel about psychological testing
Yeah.
for military personnel. Because the greatest test, which I tell people, again, I've studied a little bit of the biggest predictor of trauma, so we call it PTSD now, is previous trauma, not the experience you went through. But a lot of the testing for our super elite, now that testing is multiple phases of psychological testing before you get into certain types of unit, which get to who is the best of the best, is this filtering system, because that's what testing for us is. It's a filter system. Like,
Yeah.
who do we let in? And then all these things that are a part of the filter system. And I think there should be more of it, but also believe, which is the problem, when you have an all volunteer force like the US military, there is and we actually will change the requirements based on our needs. And I wrote about this in my first book in Connected Soldiers. Like when we really needed things, one of the things we dropped was the felony. Like if you are convicted of a felony, you can't even carry a gun in the United States. But at one point, we were so desperate for personnel, we dropped that as one of the disqualifiers for.
Oh, okay. I don't know. And is
Yeah,
it back on or
yeah,
is it
absolutely back on, back
okay?
on.
Okay.
But there are, there's medical, all these other things that are these predictive analysis on the personality types. I'm sure it's been done. Um, yeah, I don't, cross service is harder, right? Each one of the services have their own, whether it's behavioral sciences or
Right.
whatever,
Sure. I
army of people that do the research.
this story might interest you. So you mentioned earlier the heuristics research, which is Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Well,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, so there are two Israeli psychologists. Now, the story about, I think it was Tversky, if I'm not mistaken. He was, I think, a captain maybe in the Israeli military. And there was some fight happening, whatever, close to Jerusalem. So based on the timing, it would have been the Six-Day War of 67, I'm assuming. And he's sitting in his tent solving mathematical problems. Uh, and he's being annoyed when his subordinates are, don't interrupt me unless it's a serious problem. Have you heard that story before?
I've heard a little bit of it, but go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. And so that also remind me of another, I guess, great warrior, Marcus Aurelius, which that's when I knew that he was my guy, because Marcus Aurelius really wanted to sit and read and think and be a philosopher, but he had to do those emperory things, like the emperor stuff, and he would get pissed when sometimes he'd be interrupted when he wants to be thinking. And I'm thinking, a guy who's emperor of the Roman Empire who is annoyed because he can't sit and read, this is probably a guy that I should follow somehow. And that's how I originally got into Marcus Aurelius. So I love the juxtaposition, as you mentioned earlier, about some of the generals who are great readers. You could be brawn and you could be brain at the same time.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so I love that. What I wanted to say something else. Oh, point number two of sort of personal anecdotes. I think you are, and I hope if I forgot someone, they won't be offended. Maybe my third military guy on this show, and I'm wondering if you know the other two. The more recent one was General Tata. Do you know him? Oh,
No.
General. Well, I'm sure there's a million generals, but I thought that you might know him if only because subsequent to retiring from the U.S. Army, he writes books himself. Although he's not writing, research-based books, he's writing fictional books that are, of course, based on the fact that he's got this experience. The other guy, which I think you would know of, which would certainly score in my high coolness, is Rob O'Neill. Do you know who that is?
I do know who Rob O'Neill is, yes.
Yeah, so now for those of you who don't know, Rob O'Neill is purportedly the guy who killed bin Laden. Okay, you just did a nonverbal cue, which I'm going to drill down. I am the psychologist who can read these things. Take it away, Colonel Spencer. What's going on? Why did you make that face?
No, one of our great warriors, right? So I know the requirements to become a Navy SEAL. I know the details of the Osama bin Laden raid. I know that there is some contention of who was the trigger puller, but it's irrelevant.
I've heard the same thing recently. Okay, so that's what you're alluding to.
Yeah, that's what I'm alluding to. Like it's its
The
own, and
definitive killer, we don't necessarily know. That's what you're purporting.
right. So the whole group, there's just some people that became more public, let's say.
Got it. Yes. There are other ones that they could be my neighbor. I wouldn't even know it.
Absolutely.
Wow. I guess one or two more points, and then I'll let you go. So one of the things that we often hear about brother in arms, right? You're using a kin
Mm.
term, and certainly from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. Where you become so close to these people who are in the trenches with you that oftentimes when they go back to their re real families, their biological families, they can't get the same sense of affiliation that they do with the guys that, I mean, literally were looking out day to day for their lives, right? I'm sure that's what you probably would say, that that's absolutely the case, right? Once I have gone into this firefight, I could never feel that same bond as I did with the guy that literally had my life in his hands. Yes?
Absolutely. That's a big part of my first book, Connected Soldiers. I wanted to dig into what's the research of that? Like, why do soldiers fight? We call it primary group cohesion, and there are task cohesion, social cohesion, other things. I write about this because I kind of struggled with it myself. Really, really good book called Tribe by Sebastian Junger, although for some reason tribalism is a bad thing. But he really dips into that on different societies that go to war. It makes me think of so I have small children who often ask you very thought-provoking answer questions.
Oh, did you kill anybody, Daddy?
Not that one. They pretty much know the answer to that one. One was when my son at 11 years old came home and said, "Dad, is Hamas the good guys?" Um, Based on but the other one is my daughter said, "Why do you call everybody brother?" Because she will hear me
Yeah.
talk on the phone, and I will say that often, like brother, and it's not just a term of endearment, but like you said, in battle, it's really hard when and it's beyond, of course, the person's fighting because of the people that they can not like them, but they love them because they know their survival depends on them, and it creates a very biological, physiological, everything response, and then you bond with that, you imprint with that person,
Yeah.
and it becomes not a part of your tribe, not a part of your brotherhood. That's why we call it a brotherhood or sisterhood or whatever, is that that's like family to you more than your actual family, and nobody can ever understand because they weren't in that moment with you. And then when you return to society, which is a much larger conversation, which I think is important, is that we don't have community, right? This is my book, Connected Soldiers. We're more connected than we've ever been in human species, but we're also in many ways more alone,
Right.
right? So that leads to a lot of negative behaviors, right? Increase in all these things, we call them negative behaviors, like a drug addiction and all the, all these things, suicides, all these things. And the military uniquely gives you, people think it's an awful experience, but they give you so many elements of community, and then that highest level of purpose, which is protection of your fellow soldier, identity, and that other one of just being in a tribe. And when you return to your societies, especially the US today, where less than 1% of our population ever serves in the military. I mean, it's just crazy that you won't, we say thank you for your service, but you won't, very few will actually know a veteran or know somebody, as opposed to World War II, which is kind of our romantic kind of, the greatest generation. When they returned, every community had veterans in it, and they
Right.
often banded together. And that was part of how they dealt with the war, which really leads into this research about how do you, not only how do you function in a war, but how do you live with a war, which is awful situations. I call a lot of people brother, and my kids like, how many brothers you have? It's a term of endearment, really unique to the military, but there's a lot of history to it.
Very, very beautiful answer. I'll end it with the following, which kind of builds on what you're saying. Probably no fan emails gives me greater pleasure than when I receive it from military guys. And so, by proxy, I'm not a military guy, but when you're getting the imprimatur from a military guy saying, "God damn, I love you," or whatever it is that they write, it immediately transports me to being part of, as you said, that band of brotherhood. So I get a lot more sense of pride and satisfaction from a military guy writing to me with nice words. As a matter of fact, I had one who sent me a whole bunch of stuff like medals, and and this was more to share with my son with a beautiful letter. I get a lot more pleasure from that than some highfalutin professor from the ivory tower, appreciating my work. Not to imply that I don't appreciate that, but there is really something that naturally makes me band with those guys, even though I never served in the military. So maybe in another life, I could have been a warrior with John Spencer. Uh,
Absolutely.
One other point, I will now rectify the fact that I don't follow you on X, and I will ask everybody else to go follow you on X because you're doing some really good work. Can you tell us what is your X feed and your website so that people can go and follow your work?
Sure. My X feed is at Spencer Guard. I put all my publications and everything in one place on my website, johnspenceronline.com. And that's it, what it is.
Wonderful. Colonel, what a pleasure it is to meet you. Uh, Please try to achieve this for me. I do have a fantasy, maybe I'm too old now, of actually riding shotgun, so to speak, in one of those two men Air Force things. I'm in the back. I'm sure I'm gonna drop dead and have a heart attack. But assuming that I cleared the medical thing, I am in good shape for my age. If you can make it happen, you'll even go up higher in my.
I would rather God bring you to West Point, which is like Hogwarts, but the history of that ground predates, America, the honor and all those values, like
I
you
would
said,
love that.
selfless service. You need to come to West Point, hopefully we'll make that. I can do that rather than have you fly around in some plane. I
Fair
can
enough.
try to do that. Let's say I can try to do that.
Fair enough. I'm holding you accountable to
All right.
that invitation. I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you so much for coming on. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline and come back anytime you'd like. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, brother.
Cheers.